Panel of the day. As we heard earlier, Smith's writings broke new ground in many different ways, and he's often quoted as being one of the founders of what we think of today as the discipline of economics. And as Steve said in the panel, many people before him had thought about the different factors that impact on a commercial society, but Smith's influence was clearly significant. Now, to reflect on Smith's economics and to discuss whether he would be surprised, disappointed, pleased by the modern commercial society we see today and what we can still learn from Smith for today's modern debates in the economy, we've assembled another fantastic panel for you. To chair this session, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Maha Rafi Atal, a lecturer in global economy here at the University of Glasgow. An expert in the political economy of corporate power, something Smith, of course, had quite a bit to say back in his time. Maha has also been an award-winning journalist, having published her work in Forbes, Fortune, and the Washington Post. Prior to coming to Glasgow, Maha was a postdoctoral fellow at Copenhagen Business School and is a graduate of Cambridge, Brown, and Columbia Universities. Can we please welcome Maha and our panel?
Thanks so much, Graham, for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you all this morning. We have been having a discussion, just before the coffee break, very much about Scotland in the 18th century, and we're going to jump quite rapidly forward into the world in the 21st. And so I wanted to say a little bit, just to open the discussion, about what seems to have changed and what doesn't in that time. And as Graham said, I'm a scholar of corporations, corporate power, how corporations today exercise various forms of political influence in the societies in which they operate, from kind of local influence on the communities around their operations to more national and global influence on our culture, on our politics, and so on. And I really came to Smith through that work. So I am writing at the moment about kind of contemporary corporations, large, powerful corporations, whether that's extractive industry companies, oil and gas companies, mining companies, or sort of the really large dominant companies of our time, right, the big tech monopolies. And one of the things I've been really struck by in the work that I'm doing is the parallels between those companies and the large dominant corporations of Smith's time that he wrote about, the colonial trading corporations, of which the most famous and the one that we probably talk about the most today is the East India Company. And Smith, in his economic critique, certainly had a lot to say about the way that he felt that those large corporations, and certainly the monopolistic corporations that had achieved certain types of regulatory carve-outs that allowed them to hold those monopolies, distorted the market in economic terms. But he also wrote quite evocatively about the way that he felt that they captured the power of the state and they distorted the relationship between the market and the state, that they were kind of a tail, right, wagging the dog of government. And that's something that at least I find is very contemporary in thinking about kind of corporate power today and the types of regulatory capture and political capture that we might associate with large corporations, so that there may not be not only economic effects, but also political and social effects to what's happening in the economy. And that is something I think that comes across very strongly from Smith's work. I mean, he's the father not only of economics, but really of political economy, which is my discipline. And I think you'll see in all of the presentations that we have today a real sense of the wider kind of social and political implications of what's happening in the economy and what we can draw from Smith in addressing that. So without any further ado, I'm just delighted to introduce this very distinguished panel. So I will introduce all of the panelists to begin with, so that we can just have a really free-flowing discussion after that. So sitting to my left, we have Professor Anne Case, who is the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. She's written extensively on the intersection of health and economics, and has received many awards for her research on the impact of economic status on health outcomes, from early childhood to early mortality. And she is the author, with Sir Angus Deaton, of Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, an investigation into the growing numbers of early deaths in the United States from suicide and drug and alcohol abuse. To her left, we have Professor Diane Coyle, who's the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. Professor Coyle co-directs the Bennett Institute, where she heads research under the themes of progress and productivity. Her latest book is Cogs and Monsters: What Economics Is and What It Should Be, on how economics needs to change to keep pace with the 21st century and the digital economy. Professor Randall Kroszner is Norman Vince Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, where his research interests include the regulation of financial institutions, international financial crises, and monetary economics. From 2006 to 2009, he also served as a governor of the Federal Reserve System, and from 2001 to 2003 as a member of the US President's Council of Economic Advisors. He currently serves as an external member of the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee. And to his left, we have Professor Doug Irwin, who is the John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College. He is also a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's written widely on trade policy and is the author of many books, including, most recently, Clashing Over Commerce: A History of US Trade Policy. He served on the staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 1986 to 1987, and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve from 1988 to 1991. So I think Anne is going to open for us with a presentation about what Smith would and would not find surprising about the economy today. I'm drawing on her expertise on health. So Anne, please take it away.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Maha. I do have some slides, mostly because the quotes I want to show you I don't have memorized, and also because I wanted to show you a few figures, because I think they tell a pretty interesting story. So would Smith be surprised by what he found if he showed up today? I think the answer to that would be no. And some of this comes back to what Steve Medema was talking about earlier about bumpers and what happens if the bumpers aren't properly installed. Free markets alone don't make a healthy or durable capitalist system, and Smith certainly understood this well. I mean, he talked about the temptation to gain advantage through price fixing or by rent seeking, which I only recently learned is a term that economists tend to use, but other people don't tend to use. So rent seeking is you do what you can to protect your space, your business. You put up walls. You might even get government to help you build those walls to help you make money. So what did Smith have to say? He said, people of the same trade seldom meet today, even for merriment or diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. And he noted that while tax laws could be cruel, they were, quote, mild and gentle in comparison to the laws that, quote, our merchants and manufacturers have extorted from the legislature for the support of their own absurd or oppressive monopolies. So he thought that there should be protection against that. And I want to, as a case study sort of from my own work, show you what happens when those bumpers aren't in place. And he wouldn't be surprised that when the bumpers aren't in place, things can go pretty badly off the rails. So the example I want to start with is the US healthcare system. I was raised to think that the US were the healthiest people in the world and that we had the best healthcare in the world, right? That's what you learn as a child. And of course, the US has one of the lowest life expectancies in the entire OECD. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, but it's hard to make the argument that it is the best. And the bumpers coming off, well, in the US, there are 6 healthcare lobbyists for every member of Congress. So just imagine you're a member of Congress and you've got 6 people following you around. That's not exactly the way it works, but you might get some sense of they're there when anything important is being legislated, and they want to make sure that big pharma or their particular hospital chain is going to be well protected, that rent seeking is perfectly in place. There's been dramatic consolidation among hospitals in the US, that these big hospital consortiums grab up other hospitals. And there's now evidence, data, that actually shows that when these mergers take place, instead of there being synergies and that bringing down prices, prices go up. And most recently, new evidence that not only do prices go up, but the quality of care falls. Thomas Philipp has a book where he argues that the US has given up on antitrust altogether, and that prices, certainly in healthcare, are higher, but prices for in many other parts of the economy are much higher in the US because we've given up on antitrust. The American Medical Association controls the number of doctors. So they're actually not a big part of the story because we only have half as many doctors, for example, as the UK has. Now, I know there are problems here too, but those half as many doctors earn twice as much money, but so it's sort of a wash. Fewer of them, more expensive. The opioid manufacturers that Angus talked about in his lecture on Thursday were very well protected by Congress. That when millions of OxyContin, which is basically heroin in pill form with an FDA label stamped on it, when millions of those were being shipped to tiny towns in West Virginia, and the Drug Enforcement Agency was ready to pounce on that, Congress acted. Oh, no, 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 you can't do that. That's not, so the opioid manufacturers made good use of Congress to protect their pocketbooks. Now, this is where I wanted to use pictures worth 1,000 words. If you look at life expectancy and expenditure on healthcare, from 1970, that would be the lower left corner, up through 2015, that's the upper right corner. What you see for the UK is life expectancy rose pretty dramatically. Prices went up as well, or spending went up as well, and progress was being made. And if you look what happened in Australia, it's in the same neighborhood, right? So they look like things got much better in terms of life expectancy. More money is being spent, but with good results. Canada is a little bit more expensive. You can see that in any given year per person, more is being spent. But they're still neighbors in this case. France is right up there as well in the same neighborhood. Relative to the US, Switzerland is the next most expensive country. The Swiss live 5 years longer than Americans, but they have an expensive system. Now, if you compare all of these to what happened in the US over this period of time, here's what the US looked like between 1970 and 1982. Lower life expectancy, more expensive. But between 1982 and 1990, prices basically doubled. And you can see we're not keeping pace with with these countries that might be considered good comparison countries to us. And between 1990 and 2015, prices just exploded in the US. And $1.05 in the US goes into the healthcare industry, right? So that money is not available for education, for putting bread on the table, for any other purpose. It's being sucked into the healthcare industry. So Ken Arrow, who actually proved a lot of the mechanisms that we heard about free markets, actually decided he would look at the healthcare market and see whether or not this was a good candidate to be a free market. And he concludes the postscript to his famous paper on this is that the logic and limitations of ideal competitive behavior under uncertainty force us to recognize the incomplete description of reality supplied by the impersonal price system. So the people in the healthcare industry is saying we should have free markets. The free market would do better. But in this case, that would be ridiculous. It just would not, because for what Ben Friedman said, under certain conditions, the free market works well. Well, those conditions aren't satisfied by the healthcare industry, but the bumpers are off, and they're taking a very large part of the American pie. A second thing was that Adam Smith really did believe in education. And unfortunately, in the US right now, the education system is sort of bimodal. A lot of high schools are laser focused on the minority of students who are college bound, but the rest of the students don't get the kind of training they would need to be able to go and get good jobs in the economy as it now exists in the US. He wrote, this is from Smith, an instructed and intelligent people, that would be an educated people, are always more decent and orderly than an ignorant and stupid one. They feel themselves each individually more respectable and more likely to obtain the respect of their lawful superiors. They are less apt to be misled into any wanton or unnecessary opposition to the measures of government. In free countries where the safety of government depends very much upon the favorable judgment which the people may form of its conduct, it must surely be of the highest importance that they should not be disposed to judge rashly or capriciously concerning it. And in the US, what's happened is that we've stopped thinking about education for the people who are not going to college. And education currently is the great divide in the US. So it divides everything. People who have a bachelor's degree, which is our four-year education system, they are able to get good jobs, stable jobs, jobs where pay goes up year after year. They're more likely to get married. They're more likely to be thriving. Whereas people without a BA in the US right now, marriage rates have tumbled really dramatically. Out of wedlock childbearing has increased really dramatically. Their jobs are less stable, and their sense of self. I think for many people, your job gives you a sense of self, has deteriorated enormously. So much so that, for example, in the US right now, in these deaths of despair that Angus and I have been studying, this is death from suicide or drug overdose or alcoholic liver disease. It's all death by one's own hand, one way or another. And we just coined the term deaths of despair literally to describe these three kinds of deaths. But it's hard not to think that there's despair associated with all three kinds. If you look at what's happened between the early 1990s and 2020, so basically a 30-year span here, for people who don't have a college degree, there's been this dramatic increase in these deaths, so much so that the mortality rate from these causes of death are higher than mortality rates from cancer for people, and they're higher than the mortality rates from cardiovascular disease. So it's an enormously important cause of death now in the US. It's almost passed by the people with a BA. So we study pain, we study mental health. A lot of those things are self-reported and are much easier to dismiss. But these are death rates, right? This is a body count. This is what's happening in a society where we've stopped caring about the education or the training of people who are not college-bound. Now, we don't have education, deaths by education for Scotland, but I wanted to just show you to end on an even grimmer note. Here's what a drug mortality overdose looks like in Scotland. from 2000 through to 2021. And you can see there's been this enormous increase in deaths here as well. And where we're currently sitting, right, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, you can see that the center of this is actually where we're sitting currently. So the questions are, these people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to become a drug addict, right? What happens? What are the root causes of this? What can we do? And I think that putting bumpers back on the system in some cases may help that enormously. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Diane. Well, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here, but I'm slightly daunted. And it's not only because I'm one of the kind of people Craig described earlier who had to blow the dust off their undergraduate copy of The Wealth of Nations, but also because the previous panel was brilliantly opened by my PhD thesis advisor. So Ben, please mark me leniently after this one. So would Adam Smith be surprised? And I think he would be vindicated, but perhaps surprised by the extent to which the division of labor has driven a universal opulence. And as we've heard already this morning, the Wealth of Nations starts with this key mechanism of economic progress. It's the specialization that comes with the division of labor, the increased skill that embodies in the products, but goes along with the scope of the market. So if you're able to make 10,000 pins and not 100 pins, you need a bigger market to sell them into. But when that happens, you get the virtuous circle of increasing returns and expanded exchange, and that drove the Industrial Revolution. It drove the modern economic growth miracles in Southeast Asia, for example. So that mechanism as the driver of progress has been completely vindicated by experience since The Wealth of Nations was published. But I think he might be surprised by the extent to which it has gone these days. With the creation of global production networks, these extended supply chains that cross national borders, to the extent that any device that you own or car that you drive has components that have been made in very many different countries and managed through complicated logistics chains and assembled and creating a lot of value. And so the scope of the market really in these kinds of goods and services is as big as it can be until we colonize Mars. These are global markets and extraordinarily sophisticated global production networks. There are two flies in the ointment thinking about it from the perspective of Smith. One is that he very much saw manufacturing as creating value, and yet what we see is that the richer the economy, the higher the share of services and intangibles in value creation. Now, it's not that the materials that we use are not important, and in fact, there's a wonderful book coming out next week by Ed Conway called The Material World, which is about exactly how crucial different materials, as basic as salt or as exotic as the lithium and mineral salts that we need for batteries, how important they are. But if you look at the share of GDP that's being created by intangibles and services, that has been going up and up since at least the 1970s and probably earlier. So the intangible value creation is here to stay, and there are many examples of this. And you can think about something like the idea that you can address cardiovascular disease by taking a mini aspirin every day, and that's something that actually uses less material than a non-mini aspirin. It's not really a material intervention, it's an idea that contributes to people's health. Or you can think about it in terms of the process innovations, the amazing logistics that underpin these fantastic supply chains. Of course, there are telecoms networks and computer devices and mobile devices that enable that, but a lot of it is the idea of thinking about how can you reorganize production. And a lot of productivity growth is driven by these kind of process innovations, all the way from
the system of interchangeable parts in the early 19th century through to the lean manufacturing revolution of the 1970s and the digital platform models that we see today. So I would really enjoy debating that with Adam Smith. You know, would he revise his opinion about the relative importance of manufacturing and services, because he rather thought many services ate value rather than creating it. But the other issue I want to touch on is competition, because of course specialization, the division of labor, the scope of the market is a key part of the story. But as Anne was just introducing us to, he also very much emphasized the importance of competition to prevent this rent-seeking behavior, to ensure that gains from ideas and technical progress benefited everybody. The opulence has to be universal, not for the minority. And I was thinking about this when I heard Brad Smith of Microsoft on the radio recently in the UK. The Competition and Markets Authority had prevented Microsoft from taking over a games company, Activision, and Brad Smith went ballistic about this on radio as a hysterical reaction to the fact that Microsoft, which has made hundreds of acquisitions, was being stopped from making one of them. And it reminded me of that famous line from Book 4, the insolent outrage of furious and disappointed monopolists. And we are in a world, obviously, where, as Anne was just telling us, there has been an increasing concentration in many industries, and big tech, one of Maha's specialities, is part of that story. And in a world of increasing returns, with very high fixed costs of investing in the systems, in the software, in the networks, the marginal cost of serving an additional customer is very low, so you want the scope of the market to be global, and that's where the big tech companies have got to, and others too. But it's also a problem because of the specialization in these supply chains. There's a very large market for cars, but there's a very small market for some of the very specialized widgets that go into cars. We saw this also with the vaccines during the pandemic, and there's a nice book about the BioNTech vaccine development by Joe Miller, and he talks about one of the key bottlenecks being that there was only one company that made the little vials that they could put the bioactive materials into. And so the materials were created in Germany and Belgium, and they had to be shipped to this one company in Northern Ireland to put them in the vials. And of course, the supply chains expanded later. This is at the start. And this is at a time when we couldn't get sausages across the Irish Sea because of all the Brexit obstacles. So these markets and the supply chains are also tending to be concentrated. And so big is more efficient in big tech. We want the global market, we want the Martian market because we can serve the Martians just as cheaply. But if you're a manufacturer of very specialized little widgets, your market may be global too. And so the thought I want to end with, and again I would love to discuss this with Adam Smith, is there now a trade-off between progress driven by specialization and progress widely shared through competition? Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I wanted to start with a poem in honor of Adam Smith's 300th birthday. Through the pages of his Wealth of Nations, Smith unveiled the power of market creations. The invisible hand guiding supply and demand enlightened minds across the lands. He spoke of self-interest, a human trait that, harnessed well, could elevate. Competition and trade, the keys to progress, unlocking prosperity no less. Free markets he championed with great zeal, their power to foster growth and heal. Efficiency and innovation they would bring, a symphony of exchange where we all could sing. 300 years have come and gone, yet his influence remains forever strong. Adam Smith, we honor your lasting worth, a visionary economist who reshaped the earth. That was from ChatGPT. And Adam Smith, would he have been surprised at that? Yes. But he, in certain ways, I think, did anticipate something like this, because he said it's all about innovation. Part of the reason of the motivations for, or the consequences of, as well as the consequences of the principle of natural liberty to allow competition, to allow the unleashing of these forces of human beings was innovation. And so, although obviously he would not have anticipated something specific like this, the idea that those forces could have led to something revolutionary, I think, is very much part and parcel of what Smith's thinking was about. I had to do a little bit of editing, but it was basically ChatGPT that did that. So but I thought that was kind of an interesting place to start, to just see what the unleashing of these forces could do. But as was discussed in a little bit in the previous panel, my focus is to be on banking and financial regulation. And Smith certainly was not an advocate of complete free banking in Scotland or in the UK during that period. You know, his principle of natural liberty is, to quote Wealth of Nations, in general, if any branch of trade or any division of labor be advantageous to the public, the freer and more general the competition, it will always be the more so. And he certainly thought that in many areas. Building on what Anne has mentioned, he wrote a letter to the Duke of Buccleuch, who he drolly observes, that doctors are sometimes fools just as other people is not in present times one of those profound secrets which is known only to the learned. And it very seldom happens to a man that he trusts his health to another merely because the other is a doctor. He was opposed to the equivalent of the American Medical Association. So he certainly went further than we would today. He was opposed to occupational licensing in something even as important as healthcare. And so really underscored that it's very important to allow competition to occur, and we can allow people, even in an area that is so important and so difficult, like healthcare, to make their own choices. That was not true when it came to banking. So he thought competition was important to provide entry and it provided valuable market for entry and to provide valuable market discipline. But he had a number of regulations that he was very supportive of. So one, he opposed the issuance of banknotes, because in the old days, the banknotes were issued by the banks themselves, not by a central authority. The Bank of England had been created and was issuing Bank of England notes, but in Scotland, the private banks were issuing their notes. But he very much supported a ban on small notes being below £5 at the time, which would be equivalent of roughly £750 today. He opposed what is called the option clause, which was installed into the notes to deal with liquidity issues. So he's keenly aware of the liquidity issues that we see in banking and financial services today. Exactly what happened to Silicon Valley Bank in the U.S. There was a sudden call within 24 hours of more than half of the deposits on the bank. So what were installed in these private notes during the Scottish free banking period was the option clause that gave the banks the option to say, well, we're not going to redeem in specie, so in gold. We're going to delay you 6 months before that. So that would prevent a run from occurring if there's a sudden spike. Now you could also, obviously what Smith argued was that this relieved the banks of their obligation to provide the specie immediately. But it was a contractual innovation. People didn't have to accept notes that had an option clause in them, but the option clause did evolve in that way. So it's sort of interesting that Smith thought that it was inappropriate to allow for this legal innovation, to allow this to, rather than say, well, let's see what competition would bring. There would be notes with and without the clause. Would the ones without the clause survive and the ones with the clause be competed out? Obviously, he didn't believe so, and he thought it was important to set the bumper to be the base that everything has to be immediately redeemable. Now that's, I think, a bit problematic because it doesn't give any out for these liquidity issues, and I think that it was quite sensible to have some form of a clause that recognized the potential for these liquidity spikes that could help to relieve runs on institutions. Also, as mentioned in the previous session, he supported usury. He supported limits on the amount of interest that could be charged to individuals, and he broadly supported the Bank of England, one of the biggest monopolists of the time. And so, why was this? Why in this area did he seem to deviate from the traditional principle of natural liberty that he supported in so many other areas? Well, I think it very much relates to a lot of the work that's been done in banking and financial services, and some of which has recently won Nobel Prizes, with Ben Bernanke, who I'd worked with when I was at the Fed, and who's a good friend and who is very much interested in economic history, as well as Doug Diamond, who shared the prize with him, who focused a lot on issues of information asymmetry and difficulty of monitoring, focusing on the problems that come with runs. And so many people have drawn the conclusion, well, we should have something like deposit insurance to try to prevent those, but potentially an alternative would be a contractual approach, like was done during the Scottish free banking period, where there was this option clause within the notes. Also, interestingly, Smith thought about some of the things that Bernanke had discussed in his work in the 1930s, that when banks disappear, the banking relationships can disappear and can be very disruptive, not just to the individuals who are involved in the banks, but overall to overall prosperity and the difficulty of rebuilding those relationships. And he also was had focused on too big to fail issues. So I just want to have a couple of quick quotations on here, where the issuing of banknotes for such small sums is allowed and commonly practiced, many people both are enabled and encouraged to become bankers. So this is the preface before he says he doesn't believe that is a good thing. But the frequent bankruptcies to which beggarly bankers, he referred to them often as beggarly bankers, must be liable may occasion to be very considerable inconveniency and sometimes even a very great calamity to many poor people who have received their notes in payment. So he understood kind of the bigger picture issue for the inconveniency that would disrupt the lending process, disrupt the credit supply process, but also a very great calamity to many poor people. And this actually gets back to a very important point that Ben Friedman had made about one of the key contributions, I think, in a different way of thinking about broadly economic issues, and really is with us today, is we think about the overall population, and the economic consequences of different regulations and activity, not for subsets of the population, but the population as a whole. And he clearly was very concerned about how poor people, and we can proxy that potentially for also potentially people who don't have as much information as others, may be hoodwinked into taking these notes with the option clause in them. So it's interesting that he thought about that, about these information asymmetry issues. Also, he has a very interesting quotation, this next quotation, about competition, but also concerns about too big to fail. The late multiplication of banking companies, both in parts of the United Kingdom, an event by which many people have been much alarmed, instead of diminishing, increases security of the public. It obliges also all of them to be more circumspect with respect to their conduct, so the classic improvements that come with competition and the discipline that the market puts on, by not extending the currency beyond the due proportions, so not dramatically expanding, having an inflation, and then not being able to have enough support, the goal behind it. But also it restrains the circulation of each particular company within a narrower circle and reduces their circulating notes to a smaller number. But dividing the whole circulation into a greater number of parts, the failure of any one company, an accident which in the course of things must sometimes happen, so that there must be bank runs in order to have the discipline, becomes of less consequence to the public. This free competition to obliges all bankers to be more liberal in their dealings with their customers, lest rivals should carry them away. So it's very, very interesting to see in this passage, he's both sort of with one hand giveth and one hand taketh away. He's very concerned about too big to fail. He thinks competition can be a very valuable thing, but he puts bumpers around it. He says there are certain clauses that shouldn't be there. He's concerned about excess interest or excessively high interest being charged, and refers to the beggars the bankers as beggarly, not the beggars as bankerly. Perhaps both ways. I hadn't really thought about that before, and so I think he would not be surprised that there's so much regulation that goes on in the banking industry. I think he would be surprised that we still suffer so many of these problems, just like the ones that we saw with Silicon Valley Bank, and we haven't quite solved them. But I think it creates an interesting dialogue with the banking regulation today, whether it's in the UK or in the US. Thank you.
So I believe it will be the case that I'm the only panelist who's wearing an Adam Smith tie. And I do so not to make a political statement, but for two reasons. First of all, if you can't wear an Adam Smith tie on his 300th birthday in Glasgow, where could you possibly wear an Adam Smith tie? But also to underscore an important feeling of mine that Adam Smith is an underrated economist. Now, that may seem to be a preposterous statement. Here we are celebrating Adam Smith. He's glorified in so many ways. How could he be possibly underrated? Well, in my field of international trade, most of the attention goes to David Ricardo, another great economist who came up with a theory of comparative advantage that is worthy of our study today, of course. But in my view, Smith was a much richer, deeper, more brilliant exponent of the benefits of free trade and the costs of protection. And he did both. He made the positive case for free trade. He made the negative case against protectionism. And each one is deep, subtle, brilliant, and very powerful. So how did he come to this? Why was free trade important? He was emphatic in these views. 3 reasons. First of all, economic welfare. There's nothing less than the standard of living of a country that is at stake in terms of how open or closed you are to international trade. It's a matter of economic benefit, division of labor, specialization, productivity benefits, all those things come about. He was especially emphasized the importance of free trade in food, because that would avoid famine, and if one country began to restrict its exports of food, that would lead other countries to restrict their markets as well, and that is exactly what happened in 2011, 2012, and has happened many times in the past when we get these food price spikes and countries start hoarding their own food. It leads to these knockoff effects. So economic welfare, number 1. Number 2, politics, because trade barriers breed corruption, and corruption feeds back into more trade barriers, the rent seeking that we've been talking about. So it distorts politics when you have the clamoring manufacturers making demands on governments for special privileges. So to clean up politics, you had to clean up trade barriers. Cleaning up trade barriers is one way of accomplishing that. The third reason, justice. He talks about how when England levies export taxes on wool producers for the benefit of the wool manufacturers, that's an injustice because you're taking from them in an inappropriate way, not commensurate with the rules of justice, to favor one group in society against another. Now, it's interesting, he might have added a 4th one, world peace or peace. But as Maria showed us, he was not a 19th century Cobdenite Manchesterite, believed that free trade would lead to world peace. He was much more nuanced on that. So he wouldn't include that. But those 3 key reasons, economic welfare, politics, and justice, were powerful enough. And if you want to throw in world peace, that would be very nice as well. So it's a very cogent case for free trade, very powerful in terms of his violent attack on the whole commercial system of Great Britain, powerful in terms of the arguments against protection. He was, of course, nuanced. He wasn't dogmatic. He had 2 exceptions, both of which are relevant and discussed today. The first being national defense. Defense is more important than opulence. This is a huge part of the trade debate in the United States today, where national security and trade are deeply intertwined, And the debate, of course, is where do you draw the line? So if economists step back and say defense is more important than opulence, the question is how much opulence are you willing to sacrifice for, and what probabilities do you assess to national security risks? So there will always be that debate about where you draw that line. The second exception that Smith points out is non-discrimination. So it is all right for a country to levy tariffs on the border if they are to compensate for domestic taxes or impositions you apply to your domestic producers. That's leveling the playing field. Those tariffs are acceptable. This plays into the European Union's policy regarding the environment and the carbon border tax adjustment, or the CBAM as it's known, where the EU will be soon levying taxes on the border to compensate for domestic climate control policies. Adam Smith had no problem with the CBAM. Adam Smith would have problems with the US proposal, which is that we levy the tariffs on the border and not regulate our own domestic carbon emissions. That's not the level playing field. But that's where the debate in the United States is to some extent today. So we live in a globalized world, as Diane was saying. What would he think about this world today? Well, he has the statement in The Wealth of Nations: the discovery of America and the passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope are two of the greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. That's a huge statement. Why is this so important? Because it's linking two distant markets that had not been interconnected and allowing the trade and commerce with one another with all the benefits that would come thereby. I would submit to you that we have, in the past 30 years, lived through an equally historic period in human history. We've lived through a historically unprecedented uniting of the world economy. Think back to 1985. There were three worlds. The first world of North America, Western Europe, Japan, and a few others. The second world, the communist world, the Soviet Union, Eastern European satellites, China. And the third world, the global south, developing countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. These were largely non-integrated, distinct entities. Communist countries obviously didn't want to trade. They didn't have market economies. The global south protected their markets through import substitution policies. The GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, largely just covered Western Europe, North America, and a few others. What happened? That was in 1985, as late as 1985. Think about just 10 years later, 1995. The barriers between those three worlds had been erased in large measure. The Berlin Wall had fallen, communism had collapsed, the global south began to open up their markets, and what we have seen since about 1990 or so is an unprecedented expansion of global commerce, largely as a result of unilateral tariff reductions and quantitative restriction reductions in the developing world. We've seen it in China, we've seen it in India, we've seen it in Vietnam, we've seen it in Bangladesh, we've seen it in Chile, in Peru, and Colombia, we've seen it in Central America to some extent, we've even seen it in parts of Africa, Ethiopia, Uganda, even Tanzania. The result is absolutely historic. What has come about as a result of this globalization process? We have seen rapid growth in many developing countries and emerging markets around the world, with stunning improvements in standards of living. For the first time in modern history, we are seeing a reduction in global inequality. If you look at Branko Milanovic's data on global inequality from 1800, when the Madison data start, linearly, since then we've had divergence between the rich countries and the poor countries in the world. Lant Pritchett, a great development economist, had an article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives around 1990 called The Great Divergence, Diverging Economies. Those data in Madison and elsewhere since about 1990, 1995 or so have moved in the other direction towards global inequality, something we haven't seen in 2 centuries since Adam Smith's time. Convergence, from divergence to convergence. With that convergence, with that more rapid economic growth in many of the large countries, we've seen a massive reduction in global poverty. In 1985, when I started my little experiment, 40% of the world's population was in extreme poverty. According to the World Bank, that's about 1.9 billion people. Go forward to 2019, we've gone from 40% to 8.5%. And now we have about 700 million people in extreme, dire global poverty. But that's moving 1.3 billion people away from the knife edge of life and death and extreme poverty, to approaching middle class, but something where they're much safer and you'll be healthier as a result. That's an astounding progress just over the past 25, 30 years or so. What does that mean? Lower infant mortality, less infectious disease, longer life expectancy, better health outcomes, as Professor Deaton has pointed out in his book, The Great Escape, even better educational opportunities, and what have you. And for some countries, this has happened so fast, it's not across generations, it's within generations. I had a stunning conversation with a Dartmouth student from Vietnam. We were talking about the tremendous economic progress Vietnam's made over the past few decades, and I said, it's just amazing, your life is so much different than your parents'. And she corrected me. She said, my life is so much different than my brother. Her brother was 10, 12 years older than her, didn't get a chance for higher education. The family was so poor, but income had risen so rapidly and the family had done so well that they could send their youngest daughter to Dartmouth College in the United States of America. That's within generations, within the span of a few decades. So Adam Smith famously said, no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the greater part of its members are poor and miserable. That applies to the world as well. We cannot be a happy planet where the vast majority are doing so badly, but we've made huge progress in the past 3 decades. Adam Smith would welcome these developments, and I think he might rightly take it as confirmation of his views about the power of commerce to bring about economic betterment. If you don't believe Adam Smith, believe the great Irishman Bono, who for many years was saying we need more foreign aid, we need more redistribution, we need more transfer payments, and he's come around to the view, as he puts it, ugh commerce. He says ugh because he can't bring himself to say commerce is more powerful than the action of benevolent individuals in making transfers across countries. Professor Deaton was asked a question in his talk the other night by someone who said something about how Bangladesh is suffering because of globalization and the IMF or what have you. I was stunned by that question because according to many figures, Bangladesh now has a higher per capita income than India. And that's because of reform and opening up and garment exports and commerce. There's an economics commentator in the United States, Noah Smith, who's no relation as far as I know to Adam Smith, but he wrote this about what's going on in Bangladesh. For Americans, Bangladesh's growth should remind us that globalization is still an incredibly powerful force for good. Access to European and US export markets has been crucial. We should remember not to throw a wrench in that progress by restricting trade and closing our markets. We should remember that far away from our bickering culture wars and policy debates, the lifting of the world's indigent masses to the safety and comfort of material plenty is still the biggest and most important story in the world. To which I think Adam Smith would say, Amen.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the panelists for their really thought-provoking remarks. I'm going to abuse my privilege as chair for a few minutes to ask a couple of questions, but then we will open up to the floor, and we will have some roving mics, so do be thinking of your questions. Anne, I want to come back to you for a moment. I was really struck in your presentation that the link that you made between health and education, and that you placed up that quote from Smith about the way in which an educated populace it engages in more mutual respect across social classes, right? That there's respect across those classes in a society where everybody's educated. And I guess I wonder whether, in your estimation, the really disturbing developments in kind of health outcomes that have been taking place in the United States in particular, right, among the white working class in particular areas, to what extent is perhaps a lack of mutual respect or of civic equality a driver either of that despair that's contributing to those deaths, or or contributing to the failure of government to be either willing or able to respond to it?
That's a great question. I think there's, in the US right now, this real meritocratic hubris, this idea that, well, you all had a chance to go to college, and if you didn't go, that's somehow your fault, and you're on your own. And so people who did not go to college either, or they may go back and forth between being really angry about what's being said to them, and also thinking maybe the person's right. So this gives way to really, there's a politics of humiliation, really, associated with not going to college. And I think that we can't solve this until there's a sense in which people who are trained as, name your favorite service, a plumber, or an artisan of various sorts, or your barista is actually treated with the same amount of respect as your dentist or your physician. I don't know how we make that happen, but I do think that without this sense, this self-esteem that gets lost, that actually Smith talks about, I don't know how we move forward with that.
Thanks. I want to cross back over to Doug for a moment, because you're talking about kind of self-esteem, right, and the relationship between that sense of self-esteem and the economy. And certainly in my field of international relations, there are scholars who argue that nations also have a sense of self-esteem. In academic jargon, we call this ontological security, the sense of self that a country has. And I know that certainly in the debate that's taking place in the U.S. About sort of trade and the relationship between trade and national defense, right? There's a sense of national self-esteem that's maybe wrapped up in those debates. Is it your assessment that sort of the driver of that push for a more restricted and certainly more combative trade policy vis-a-vis certain powers, and in particular China? You frame that, and certainly Smith frames that as a question of how much opulence you would sacrifice, right, for defense. But at least when you hear American policymakers talk about this, the impression they give is that this push to a more restrictive trade policy, will have positive economic effects at home in terms of either protecting or creating jobs as a form of industrial policy and so on. So do you feel that there is that trade-off the way Smith is describing it, either in your sense of the economy or in the way that the debate is being experienced at home?
Well, first of all, no one's going to sell their program by saying it's going to make us safer but poorer. So I think you know that in Britain here, right? How is Brexit sold? Okay? So it's going to make us richer, right, if we separate and isolate our market. So there wasn't honesty in the debate about what would be the economic sacrifice involved for the UK if you pull out of, not pull out, but, have more restricted trade with a huge market. So same thing in the United States. If you want to get something passed in terms of industrial policy for semiconductors or the move to clean energy, politically you don't want to emphasize the costs. So everyone sort of gets a pass for that. But I think the question is, here we talked about supply chains and Apple. Apple basically is 100% in China in terms of the iPod, in terms of the iPhone and what have you. They're trying to diversify for geopolitical reasons, not for economic efficiency reasons necessarily, although wages have been going up in China and what have you. But their plan for the next 5 years is to go from 100% dependence on China to 95% dependence. It's really hard because what other big market will accommodate you? Vietnam, not quite big enough, not the suppliers. India, still a bit of a mess. And so there's an economic cost, an efficiency cost doing so. Is it wise to do that? I would say, certainly in the case of semiconductors, there's a very strong case to be made that we don't want 90% of the world's high-end semiconductors made in Korea and Taiwan, which are one's next to North Korea, one's next to China, and there's a lot of political tensions there. And so you might want the government to foster that diversification, because you have to overcome the economic efficiency of the economies of scale and what have you in those markets. So I do think there will be some sacrifice. Get into the debate about industrial policy. I mean, Intel's trying to create a plant in Ohio. There's huge construction costs, huge delays. We don't know where the skilled workers are going to come from. We don't have an immigration policy that will say, let's take skilled engineers from Taiwan and bring them over, invite them in. And so the head of TSMC, the leading semiconductor manufacturer in Taiwan, says, my costs will be double. The construction costs are double in the US what they are in Taiwan. There's not the labor, but guess what? We're going to do it because we're subsidized. So that may be prudential for national security. I'm not sure it's an economic efficiency winner.
Yeah, of course.
So I wanted to ask Doug a question, which is, I agree with your assessment about bringing literally billions of people out of poverty through the reduction of trade restrictions in the global south. But I'm wondering, what do you think we owe? Do we owe anything to people at home, right? So China joins the World Trade Organization. A lot of the industries in the US entirely collapse. The tax base in those towns collapse. The school systems rot. Do we owe anything to people within our own borders, people who also vote, people who we might feel we have some extra connection with relative to the world as a whole, which might actually benefit from this explosion in trade?
Absolutely. That doesn't mean creating trade barriers or stopping those Bangladeshi garments from coming in, but that means a social safety net at home. That's our failure. It's not a failure of globalization, it's a failure of domestic policy to help those communities, to help those workers in an effective way. At the same time, in the US there's a debate about the China shock. If you had told me over the span of 2 decades that we're going to expand the effective global labor supply by 20 or 25% in a very short period of time, and 1.5, maybe 2 million American workers are going to be displaced. So you're adding to the global labor pool of 1 billion people, and 1 million, 2 million are going to lose their job in the US. You don't want to create any impediment to those billions raising their standards of living, but what you do want to do is help those 1 or 2 million, which is astoundingly small in some sense when you think about it at a global scale. You want to help them make that adjustment, make that transition.
Diane, do you want to come in
Well,
here?
I was just reflecting that we started with a very pessimistic perspective on this side of the panel, and we ended up with a very optimistic perspective on that side of the panel. And I'm a wonderfully trained economist, and so believe in the power of free markets and exchange. But if you reflect on where we are in the US and the UK at the moment, we've got a system that is not working for people. We've got a food system that creates highly processed foods that are making people obese and ill. We've got a pharmaceutical industry that requires people to stay sick and in some extreme cases has killed its patients. We've got a financial system that has impoverished millions of taxpayers through repeated crises. So this is just not working at the moment. And so it's a great moment, I think, to reflect on exactly this kind of debate. And it is, I think, a bit more nuanced when you're talking about workers in the United States suffering from the China shock, because those compensation mechanisms haven't worked anywhere ever in the last 30 years. It just doesn't happen. So you can say as an economist, well, there should be a great social safety net, but politically it doesn't happen, so we can't rely on that. And I think there is some revisiting in the profession at the moment, the need to think about what are you taking away from home markets by relying so much for 90% of your chips or all of your cars on plants overseas. And it is about what are the skills, what are the prospects, what's the respect that is available to people in those manufacturing communities.
Absolutely, but here's where Smith is once again incredibly wise. Trade barriers don't help. If we impose, the Trump administration, the Biden administration continue the tariffs on imported steel to help the steel workers in those communities in Akron, Ohio, and what have you. What has happened? We've maybe saved a few jobs, but the steel industry has lost hemorrhage jobs because it's become much more capital intensive and technology intensive. And we've lost jobs and forced domestic steel using firms overseas. So we've raised the cost of Toyota and Honda and Ford and GM in the United States. Produce it in Mexico. We lose manufacturing jobs when we create those barriers at the border. So that's why the agenda has to be a domestic agenda to help those workers, not one of creating trade barriers.
I'm loath to cut off such a rich exchange, but I know that we have just an incredibly rich wealth of knowledge in the room here, and I would love to invite comments and questions from the audience. So we do have some roving mics, but if you can put your hands up, I can look. Let's see, why don't we go to the gentleman in the middle here in the fifth row?
I'm Sadiq Islam from Laurentian University in Canada, where I tried to popularize Adam Smith's ideas. One question for Professor and Case, it's a simple one. Did Adam Smith mention anything about the role of market and government in healthcare? And two questions for Professor Douglas Irwin. The first one is very easy. Where did you get that Adam Smith tie? I'm looking for it. Okay. Another question. Some economists try to argue, like Paul Krugman, that in the presence of external economies, temporary protection may be justified. Do you think Adam Smith would have supported this kind of argument? Thank you.
So on what Adam Smith had to say about healthcare, I do know that he believed that apothecaries were places where very careful work was being done. So I think he would actually be very surprised to see a different kind of big pharma which is pushing very dangerous drugs onto people. I am not a Smith scholar. There are many in the room, and they may want to contribute to this conversation.
Just on that, I had cited that one quotation. I didn't get a laugh out of it. It's that doctors are sometimes fools just as other people is not in present times, not one of those profound secrets which is known only to the learned. I was hoping that we'd get a laugh from people, but I guess because I thought it was very droll how he put it, because he was using that as an example that he wouldn't want regulation of the medical profession. We would want free entry into that for people to offer their services, and then competition would lead to the most successful service providers getting the most people. Now, obviously, there are issues about information asymmetry. I'm not sure that we would say that there should be no licensing in the medical profession at all today, but he clearly applied that principle of natural liberty to that part of the labor market.
I believe you can get the Adam Smith tie at the Fraser Institute online, but you might have to Google it. I have no idea. Incidentally, the firms that produce these things, they keep going out of business, or they keep not providing them because the market's very limited. I've always said Adam Smith would have no other way. There's no reason why we should prop up production of Adam Smith ties for its own sake. If people don't want it, firms should fail. In terms of external economies, of course, there's a theoretical case where temporary protection might help out. The operational or the real world side of that is it's very difficult to identify ex ante what those industries are. And it's also very difficult for the political economy reasons that Smith identifies that you don't get into this. The trade barrier will be a complete dupery of the politicians because the industry really wants it. Every industry is going to say, we produce external economies, we're very important for national security or for what have you. And so it's very difficult to separate those things out and have an impartial spectator make the decision about what the best interventions are.
There's in the way back.
Yeah, there's one. What do we take in the back there? Yeah.
Thank you. Susan, Frank Brower, Sussex University. Are there ecological limits to Adam Smith?
Are there what?
Ecological limits.
Ecological.
I didn't want to use the word limits, so maybe I use environmental justice.
Does anybody on the panel want to speak
Well,
to that?
it's yes. So I think the answer is yes. Because as we know, there are externalities. We've been using natural resources as if it was costless since at least the Second World War. And perhaps in the post-war years that made sense because it was physical capital and human capital that were in short supply and nature seemed plentiful. But now we've got to the point where actually nature seems to be the constraint on future growth. So a lot of the work that we do is trying to think about, can you find some way of measuring and pricing that free use of natural resources that we've had for many decades now? So that is obviously something that needs to be brought to bear in thinking about the efficacy of markets. They work very well if the information signals are accurate enough about what's going on in the world, and that's a domain in which we know that they are not.
Other hands?
There's one way in the back, but also Deirdre has her hand up. See this?
We'll take the one in the back. I would like to try to hear from people that we haven't heard from already. And then after that, we'll come to the woman here, I think about 3/4 of the way back in the middle.
Hi. I'm actually from the same college as Professor Irwin. Hi, Professor. I had a question for the panel kind of as a whole. We heard a lot, especially from Professor Irwin, about the very rightful point that from Adam Smith's times, we pulled a lot of people out of poverty. But Adam Smith also wrote that the laboring poor should prosper kind of along with the rest of society. I mean, just using the US as an example, our minimum wage is nowhere near what people need to live off of. I think in 2019, something like 16.4% of Americans had multiple jobs. So I wonder what the panel would think. Would Adam Smith think that our laboring poor are prospering today?
Okay.
I think along many dimensions, it's hard to believe he would think the answer was yes, that all are prospering. I mean, I think that we're back in a position where there are a few who are the billionaire class, right, who are doing very well. But actually, it's the class of people who have been to college who are doing very well. But that's a minority, right? 60% of adults in the US do not have a college degree. And some majority of them do not have enough money so that a $400 shock to the system they would be able to manage, right? So I think he would probably not think that, I mean, as Diane alluded to earlier, there's something in this entire system that for the US and the UK is not working well. And I think that he would not say in a Panglossian way everything is for the best and the best of this possible world.
Yes, I've been quite struck listening to some of the earlier comments this morning about the division of labour as a means of recognising people's skill and enabling the development of those skills. And then you can see that as people gain knowledge, their incomes will rise along with that spread of universal opulence. And we seem to have got to a different kind of division of labour now. In fact, there's been some debate on Twitter about this in the past couple of days, where actually the division of labour is de-skilling people, you know, making things so routine. And I guess this was always the Marxist perspective about the alienation of labour. So I think it's really hard to look at some societies now and say everything is fine, and you can see political consequences of things not being fine in extreme votes and extreme perceptions and conspiracy theories in most of the Western democracies. So we shouldn't sit and be complacent, even while recognizing the amazing benefits of previous divisions of labour and growth and exchange.
Do either of you want to come in on this? Otherwise
I'm not going to answer a Dartmouth student because I get to see you all the time anyway. In any place, you should benefit from the expertise of others.
Fair enough. I think we had a question here. Yeah? I think there's the microphone. Yep. Great.
Hello, everyone. This was quite a wonderful talk. I had a question for Professor Diane. She had ended with a statement that trade-off between progress driven by specialization and a trade-off between progress driven by competition. So I would like to know that when we talk about a trade-off between progress driven by specialization, we think of countries like China who specialized in the production of one single commodity, and they basically drove the economic growth of the country. And when we think of trade-off driven by, like progress driven by competition, then we think of globalization. But in one of our globalization courses, we also learned that globalization did lead to an increase in global inequality, but it also led to an decrease in global inequality, but it also led to an increase in inequalities within countries. So I would like to know both of your thoughts on that, Professor Irwin and Professor Diane. Like, what do you think should be better?
Do you want to start?
Oh, go ahead.
You referred to Brian Coleman-Overitch's book and the famous elephant chart he showed, which showed that for most of the global income distribution, there have been tremendous gains, just as Doug was describing. But for a group of middle-class people in the rich countries, there has been a decline in prosperity. And so you get a chart that's got this nice, and the very rich have done very well. So it looks like an elephant and its trunk. So the question, and I think this might be relevant to what you were talking about, Doug, about the safety nets, is to what extent have we got policies wrong within the rich countries in responding to these trade shocks, if you like? And is it a failure to have a social safety net? Is it something to do with the decline of worker power, countervailing worker power? Is it driven by decreasing competition within our economies? And I think it's not clear which of those it is, but I do think the fact that real incomes for median households in our countries have not gone up for a very long time, and are forecast not to go up for a very long time, is a significant economic and political problem.
Yeah, and you know, Branko's revised that chart and brought it up to date, and it looks very different. It's not an elephant anymore.
What kind of animal is it now?
It's more of a hump,
a
camel or something like that. But it is higher. But anyway, you know, I think with this debate about, you know, the problems we have, and I'm not denying the problems. I want to put things in historic perspective about what the last 30 years have been for the entire world. Not denying at all that there's a huge productivity problem in Britain and Italy and across so many advanced countries. You know, when you look at where some of the problem sectors are, we've talked about health and education. Where have costs been soaring? Where have productivity increases just not been there? These are two sort of non-traded, non-internationalized sectors in some sense. And then that feeds through, that's a huge budget item. And that's what people care about. So, you know, we have to think about, once again, domestic policy. We have to think about not so much trade policy, but what is our policy regarding opening up higher education, making it more affordable, health care, the reforms there. We don't have a free market in health care at all. It's heavily regulated. There are no prices. Hospitals can you know, merge. You know, here's the classic Smith thing. If you have to ask a hospital whether a new one can move in and the hospital vetoes it, you know, there's no competition. So once again, these are all domestic policy matters that we really have to straighten out. But I do want us not to lose sight, too, of what's happened around the world, that someone writing 50 years from now, looking back, would say, this is stunning, what happened in this 20 or 30-year period. And, you know, we might be, you know, if you don't like globalization, try deglobalization, because there's some indications that we're sort of moving in that direction. We've tried that in the past. That doesn't work out so well either for anyone, if you're talking about the 1920s and 1930s.
I just want to very briefly say there is a distinction between health and health care, right? And people's health is failing. But that has a lot to do with behavioral responses to other problems that they are currently facing, right? So I just wanted to say that I think a lot of this is just an outward sign of decay in other parts of their lives.
Thank you. I think we had a question in the third row on the left in the front here. Could we get a mic down here? Is that possible? Get the microphone down here. Thank you. While the mic comes down, I'm going to ask a question to Randy that I wanted to ask, since you opened with ChatGPT. You talked about information asymmetries, right, being a driver, right, of of crisis and problems in the financial sector, both historically at the time, certainly when Smith was writing, many banking panics taken place at the time, and now with the levels of technology that we now have, right, has the information environment in banking gotten better, or are those technologies just facilitating more spread, perhaps, of misinformation or information spreading in ways that's not productive? And I know that's been something that's been debated in the recent kind of Silicon Valley collapse.
Sure. So in principle, it should have allowed for easier monitoring of the problems that Silicon Valley Bank and others had. I mean, actually, all of the issues that crystallized were available in all the reports. This was not something that, well, only the supervisors knew or just a few people knew. In fact, and I use this in my money and banking class, I look at a few of the banks, and I'll mention one, well, I won't mention the particular bank, but in their annual report, they talked about what geniuses they were by taking on this mismatch, by buying all these long-term securities that were paying more interest. And so we were able to raise dividends. We're geniuses in doing that. So you didn't even have to look at the footnotes, and this stuff was there, but people didn't look until someone did finally look, and then supposedly, because it was a relatively small community who talked to each other frequently on Slack or using these new technologies, the information could out very quickly, and suddenly you could get a request for withdrawal of 50% of deposits within 24 to 48 hours. So obviously things are much more fragile than they once were, but the potential for misinformation to come out, for rivals to put out bad information about one of their competitors, that obviously is there also. These are things that we have to really rethink, and I think we have to rethink the banking finance model. I think we have to rethink what deposit insurance would do, and that's why Adam Smith. It's sort of interesting that Adam Smith wanted to put restrictions on some sorts of contracts, because I think it would be interesting to expand the types of contracts that may be available to make some of these fragilities less likely rather than more likely.
Thank you. I think we're going to get, this will be the last question, because I know we're standing between you all and your lunch.
Thank you. Your contributions have been very illuminating, and I've learned a lot. I just want to touch on something that Professor Case and then Professor Kroszner spoke about. In the US, you have poor healthcare outcomes because you have cartel and monopolistic type behavior, and I was quite impressed by, Australia, Canada, Switzerland doing very well, whereas the UK had gone up and then plateaued. Now, I think the point that was being made, unless I've got it wrong, is that monopolistic and cartel type behavior is not good. Now, do you think the UK has plateaued because the state has a monopoly on providing healthcare? And my second question, if I may, to Professor Kroszner, we talk about banks and bank runs, and we tend to pin it on bankers. A bit of history about me: I did my PhD here in economics. Great to be back. Then I was a bond and credit derivatives trader, and now I have healthcare businesses. So I was there trading during the 2008 financial crisis at Barclays Capital. Just before, one of the biggest failures was Royal Bank of Scotland. The regulators allowed the takeover of ABN AMRO just before the crisis for 50 billion euros. The mark-to-market was minus 20 billion. Barclays was running at a core tier 1 of 4%. We were 25 times leveraged. Lehman's was core tier 1 of 2%, 50 times leveraged. Coming back to more recent events, you look at the Fed stress test of banks in 2022. They don't test for high sigma events. We don't have full implementation of Basel III. So, is it regulators having a role to play here as well, and them taking the eye off the ball that's causing these runs as well?
Thank you.
So on the health and health care, a lot of the behaviors in Britain which are causing what I would consider premature death are similar now to what we're seeing in the US, right? So worrying about obesity, worrying about alcohol, worrying about behaviors that actually kind of hold down life expectancy. It's also the case that in the UK right now, the budget appears not to allow NHS to spend the money it needs to actually be able to provide the services, although it's not clear that moving to a private provision fully would be able to do that. It's a complicated system, and I know our time is limited, but we could talk later.
Randy, to respond.
An important question, just very, very quickly on that. I think one of the challenges that supervisors have, so there's regulation and there's supervision, so it's the individuals who are out there or the supervisors, and I have a lot of sympathy for them. When I was at the Fed, I chaired the Supervision Regulation Committee, and so I know the supervisors in the field, they try to do the best that they can, but they have very limited resources. And one of the responses to the global financial crisis in the US was called Dodd-Frank. More than 28 million words have been published in the Federal Register about Dodd-Frank. Just it's astonishing how much came out of that. Now, there had to be some fundamental regulatory change. As you said, there was insufficient capital in the system, insufficient liquidity, and so we've bumped that up. And that's why we were able to, the global banking system was able to withstand the extreme shock of COVID without having a financial crisis. That's not to say it's perfect. Obviously, we've seen that it's not perfect. But one of the things that has happened, at least in the US, is there are so many specific rules that must be adhered to that that supervision has really become a check-the-box exercise. They have to implement all of these things, and then they can think about risk. Because unfortunately, many of the parts of the regulation aren't actually that well attuned to risk. They're more check-the-box type exercises. Oh, we did this wrong, we did that wrong, da-da-da-da, rather than sort of stepping back and thinking, well, where are the risks, where are the problems in the system? And so it's really a judgment about interest rate risk-taking rather than a particular rule about interest rate risk-taking that caused the issues, because the supervisors, and since we're spending so much time running these other things that really had very little to do with risk. And so for me, one of the lessons is when you want regulation, you want it to be effective regulation. Everyone thinks, well, there's a crisis, so we need more regulation. I think that's exactly wrong. And I think we're seeing a consequence, and a classic unintended consequence of just having more regulations on a bunch of things rather than thinking carefully about what do we need to regulate, and do we have the supervisory resources to make sure that we can get at the important regulatory, the important risk issues, rather than just have more and more regulations.
Thank you. I would like you all to just join me in thanking this extraordinary panel. I'll hand back to Graham, who's going to tell us a bit about lunch and the activities to follow.
Great, thank you very much, Maha, and thank you, panel, for an absolutely fascinating conversation. So that marks the end of the first half of today. We now move to lunch. So lunch is in the Kelvin Gallery, which is close by. The team are on hand to direct you. If anyone needs assistance to get there, are stairs. If you need some assistance there, please do speak to the team and they can guide you. Lunch is served there, of course. There is, of course, birthday cake, which you're welcome to have a slice to. In the gallery, crucially, that's where the artifacts, we've got 3 cases from our library displaying some of our Smith artifacts. They're going to be available all through lunchtime, so please do feel free to grab some lunch, take a stroll, go and look at the Humanities Lecture Theatre or Unicorn and Lion Staircase and come back and see them later if there's a queue there. Just quickly, it is a really great privilege we have at Glasgow to have our librarian teams working in archives. So our archives and special collections team are responsible for managing, promoting, enabling access and supporting engagement with the library's unique and distinctive collections. And members of the team are here today. Siobhan Convery, who's the Director of Library Collections and Keepers of the Hunterian Books at the University of Glasgow, Senior Assistant Librarian Julie Gardam, and Senior Librarian Archivist Graham Kemp. And Craig Smith is also going to be hanging around as well. If you've got any questions Smith-related, Craig will be there as well. At 1:45, the Hallelujah String Trio will begin to play some traditional Scottish music. And then, after some time, we're going to play the new piece of music we've commissioned by the Glasgow graduate Helen McKinnon. The trio will play that piece of new music, which our students have named the Sympathy of Moral Sentiments. My colleague Kat Riach will provide an introduction about the motivation for the composition and what it has, what's influenced it. And then after that, Kat will introduce the in-company theatre production, who will present their short dramatisation of Adam Smith called, unsurprisingly, The Life and Times of Adam Smith. Please be back here at 2:45 in the Hunter Halls for further refreshments, and the next panel will start at 3 p.m. Feel free to roam around, sunbathe. If you are going to sunbathe, please pick up a copy of ECO, the latest magazine from the Economic Observatory, run out by our friends at the University of Bristol. It's got fantastic articles on Adam Smith, some written by our colleagues today and other contributors as well. But before we break for lunch, can you please just join me in thanking our panelists once again?